The September air hung thick over the Carabanchel district, carrying diesel fumes from the city buses and the warm scent of frying churros from the corner cafe. Pablo Ruiz Mendoza, 7 years old, pressed his nose against the window of his family's third-floor apartment, watching older boys kick a deflated football against the courtyard wall below. His mother, Carmen, ironed her husband's work shirts in the next room, the radio murmuring news of Franco's declining health and rising oil prices. The afternoon stretched before them like any other Wednesday in September 1974, ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of day that dissolves into memory without leaving a trace. "Mama, can I go down?" Pablo asked, his voice small but insistent. Carmen glanced at the clock above the stove, 4:30 in the afternoon. Aurelio wouldn't be home from the textile factory until 7. She had groceries to buy before the shops closed, and the lines at the butcher's were always long on Wednesdays, when the fresh meat arrived from the countryside. "Stay in the courtyard," she said, smoothing his dark hair with her palm. "Don't go past the fountain. I'll be back in 20 minutes. Pablo bounded down the narrow stairwell, his red canvas shoes slapping against worn marble steps that had been polished smooth by decades of feet. Carmen watched from the window as he joined 3 neighborhood boys near the fountain, a crumbling stone basin where pigeons bathed and women still filled jugs when the building's water pressure failed. She turned toward the door, grabbing her mesh shopping bag and checking that she had enough pesetas in her coin purse. She never saw him leave the courtyard. When Carmen returned 40 minutes later, arms laden with bread and potatoes and a small package of pork wrapped in brown paper, the boys were still playing, but Pablo wasn't among them. She called his name from the third-floor window, her voice echoing off concrete walls streaked with rain stains and sun-bleached laundry. The boys looked up, confused. "He went to get the ball," one said, pointing vaguely toward the street. Carmen's chest tightened. She dropped the groceries on the kitchen table and ran down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, her heart hammering against her ribs. By nightfall, the entire neighborhood had joined the search. Aurelio arrived home to find his wife sobbing in the arms of a neighbor, his son's name being shouted from balconies and alleys. The Policía Municipal arrived near midnight, 2 officers with notepads and tired expressions who asked the same questions Carmen had already answered 100 times in her mind. What was he wearing? Blue shirt, brown corduroy pants, red shoes. Did he have money? No. Any family disputes? None. Did he know not to talk to strangers? Yes, of course. The officers exchanged glances. One wrote something Carmen couldn't read. "Children wander," the older officer said, his voice carrying the weary certainty of someone who'd seen dozens of such cases. "They always come back." But Pablo Ruiz didn't come back. The following morning, Carmen and Aurelio walked the streets until their feet bled, showing a school photograph to shopkeepers and taxi drivers. The photograph showed Pablo smiling, missing one front tooth, his hair combed neatly for picture day. Most people shook their heads with genuine sympathy. A woman at a produce stand thought she'd seen a boy matching his description near the Marqués de Vadillo metro station around 5 o'clock, but she couldn't be certain. "So many children looked alike at that age," she said apologetically. A bus driver claimed a child had boarded alone near Plaza Elliptica, heading south toward the working-class neighborhoods that sprawled beyond the city center. But the timeline didn't fit. Pablo had disappeared before 4:45, according to the boys in the courtyard. By the 3rd day, the case passed to a detective named Javier Solis, a man in his 50s with grey temples and a perpetual squint from reading reports under bad lighting in basement offices. He interviewed the boys from the courtyard separately, recording their statements in careful longhand. Their stories aligned. Pablo had chased the ball when it bounced toward the street. They'd assumed he'd gone home when he didn't return. Solis walked the route himself, timing how long it would take a 7-year-old to retrieve a ball and return. The courtyard opened onto Calle del General Ricardos, a busy street with trucks and delivery vans navigating narrow lanes between parked cars. Across the road stood a row of shops, a butcher with sausages hanging in the window, a cobbler who repaired shoes while customers waited, a bar that opened at noon and smelled of cigarettes and cheap brandy. None of the owners remembered seeing Pablo that afternoon. Someone would have noticed, Solis muttered to his partner, a younger officer named Enrique Torres, who'd recently transferred from traffic enforcement. A 7-year-old alone draws attention, unless he wasn't alone. Solis began checking reports of suspicious vehicles in the area. In 1974, Madrid's record-keeping was inconsistent. Handwritten logs stored in basement archives with no centralized system, no computers to cross-reference incidents across precincts. He spent days sifting through carbon-copied forms and smudged ink entries. He found 3 incidents within 2 kilometers that week. A stolen Seat 600 recovered in Villaverde with the steering column damaged, a drunk driver arrested near Legazpi after sideswiping a parked motorcycle, and a complaint about a man in a delivery truck asking children for directions near a school in Usera. The truck detail caught his attention. The complainant, a schoolteacher named Senora Marquez, had written down a partial license plate in her neat cursive, M4738. The second digit was unclear, possibly a 0 or an 8 she'd noted in parentheses. Torres spent 4 days at the motor vehicle registry, cross-referencing commercial vehicles registered in Madrid province. The registry occupied a building near Atocha station, its records stored in filing cabinets that stretched the length of 2 floors. He found 23 possible matches for the partial plate. 15 were company trucks with verified routes and drivers whose employers vouched for their whereabouts. 5 had been decommissioned, their registrations cancelled, and vehicles scrapped. 3 owners couldn't be located. 1 belonged to a man named Luis Ortega, who ran a small moving business in Vallecas. When Torres visited the address, a garage behind a residential building, neighbors said Ortega had left Madrid months earlier, owing 3 months' rent and leaving behind furniture and unpaid bills. The truck had been sold privately to settle debts, they said, but no paperwork had been filed with authorities. The trail went cold. Carmen stopped eating. She spent days walking the streets, pressing Pablo's photograph into strangers' hands, asking the same questions until her voice grew hoarse. Aurelio returned to work because they needed money. The factory wouldn't hold his position indefinitely, but he moved through the assembly floor like a ghost, making mistakes, staring at nothing during breaks. At night, Carmen left the apartment door unlocked, convinced Pablo would find his way home in the darkness, that he'd climb the stairs and crawl into his bed and wake her with his presence. Weeks became months. Detective Solis followed every lead with methodical determination. A boy's body, found floating in the Manzanares River, turned out to be a teenage runaway from Guadalajara who drowned accidentally. A tip about a child matching Pablo's description in a town near Toledo led to a family with their own son, born the same year as Pablo, who happened to own a similar blue shirt. A psychic contacted the police in November, claiming Pablo was being held in a basement near Atocha station, alive but frightened, calling for his mother. Solis organized searches of abandoned buildings in the area, finding nothing but homeless men and stray cats. By December, the case file sat in a cabinet with dozens of others, children who'd vanished, mostly runaways who eventually returned, a few who never did. Franco died in November, and Spain entered a period of uncertainty and transformation. The Ruiz family's tragedy became one among many as the nation lurched toward democracy. Carmen refused to accept it. She joined a small network of mothers whose children had disappeared, women who met in church basements and shared photocopied flyers, their faces aging prematurely from grief and sleepless nights. They pressured newspapers for coverage, staged quiet protests outside government buildings, wrote letters to officials who rarely responded. In an authoritarian state transitioning toward democracy, their voices were often ignored, dismissed as hysterical or unreasonable, but they persisted with quiet fury. One mother, Rosa Delgado, had lost her daughter in 1972. The girl, Elena, had been 9, walking home from school when she disappeared. Another, Pilar Santos, searched for her son Miguel, who vanished in 1973 from a playground in Vallecas. They became Carmen's family, bound by shared grief and determination that felt like madness to those who hadn't experienced it. They created a system, visiting police stations weekly, demanding updates, ensuring their children's cases weren't forgotten beneath administrative priorities and bureaucratic indifference. They called themselves Las Madres de la Esperanza, though no official organization existed, just a network of women who refused to let their children become statistics. The group attracted attention from a young journalist named Miguel Ortiz, who worked for a small independent newspaper called El Pueblo that operated on shoestring budgets and printer ink donations. In 1976, he published a feature about the mothers, including photographs of their missing children arranged in a grid that filled half a page. The article generated letters from readers, some offering tips that led nowhere, others sharing their own losses, parents whose children had died in accidents or illness, families torn apart by emigration and poverty. One letter mentioned seeing a child matching Pablo's description in the back of a truck near Villaverde in late 1974. But the writer provided no contact information and didn't respond to the newspaper's request for follow-up. Carmen brought the letter to Solis. He was skeptical. Anonymous tips rarely led anywhere, and memory was unreliable, especially months after an event. But he added it to the file. The mention of Villaverde aligned with the stolen truck's last known location when the drunk driver had been stopped near there. But without more information, he couldn't justify dedicating resources to what might be a false memory or well-intentioned fabrication. The investigation stalled again. Solis continued working the case in spare moments between newer assignments, but leads dried up, witnesses forgot details, and the trail grew colder with each passing season. Years passed. Aurelio left Carmen in 1979, unable to bear the shrine she'd built in Pablo's room, his toys untouched, his bed still made with the same sheets from September 1974, now yellowed and brittle. The stuffed bear Pablo slept with sat propped against the pillow. His school books remained stacked on the small desk by the window. Aurelio couldn't enter the room without feeling his chest constrict, couldn't sleep in the apartment where every corner held memories of his son's laughter. He moved to a cousin's place across the city, then eventually to Seville for work, remarrying in 1982 to a woman who'd never known Pablo and couldn't understand the weight he carried. Carmen stayed in the apartment alone, growing thin and grey, her hands roughened from working part-time at a laundry to pay rent. She washed other people's clothes and sheets, folding them mechanically, while her mind walked the same streets, asked the same questions, imagined the same scenarios of what might have happened. Solis retired in 1983. On his last day, he passed Pablo's file to a younger detective named Ana Beltran, along with a handwritten notepaper clipped to the front. The truck. Someone knows. The note sat unread for years. Spain was changing rapidly. New laws, new procedures, new priorities. Cold cases from the Franco era were viewed as relics of a different time, difficult to solve with limited resources and fading memories. Beltran had dozens of active cases demanding attention, crimes committed yesterday or last week that seemed more urgent than a disappearance from a decade earlier. But Carmen never stopped. She walked the streets every Sunday, retracing the route from her apartment to where Pablo was last seen, a pilgrimage of grief that became ritual. She spoke to new shopkeepers who'd taken over old businesses, showed them the photograph, even though they'd been children themselves in 1974 or hadn't yet arrived in Madrid. Most were kind but unhelpful. Some suggested she let go, move on, accept what couldn't be changed. A priest at her church recommended prayer and forgiveness, assuring her that Pablo was with God now, at peace. She couldn't accept that. Wouldn't. In 1987, a construction crew broke ground for a new housing development in Villaverde, on the southern edge of Madrid, where the city dissolved into scrubland and abandoned lots stretching toward the highway. The area had been used for decades as an informal dump. People discarded broken furniture, rusted appliances, construction debris, anything they didn't want to haul to official disposal sites. Developers planned to clear it and build affordable apartments, part of Madrid's expansion to accommodate growing populations and housing demands. On a Tuesday morning in March, a bulldozer operator named Ramón Esteves was scraping topsoil, clearing away layers of trash and weeds, when his blade caught on something solid that made the machine shudder. He climbed down, expecting concrete foundation or buried metal, the kind of obstacle that required careful removal to avoid damaging equipment. Instead, he found fabric, a rotted canvas tarp wrapped around a cylindrical object partially exposed by the bulldozer's blade. Ramón called his foreman. The foreman, a man named Vicente who'd worked construction for 30 years, approached cautiously. He'd found strange things on job sites before: old weapons from the Civil War, unexploded ordnance that required military disposal teams, human remains from unmarked graves. He knelt and pulled back a corner of the tarp. The foreman called the police. Officers arrived within an hour, cordoning off the area with yellow tape, while construction workers stood in clusters, smoking and speculating. Beneath the tarp, buried roughly 1 meter deep, they found a metal drum, the kind used for industrial chemicals or oil, about 1 meter tall and 1/2 meter in diameter. The lid had been welded shut with crude but effective beads of metal that had rusted but held firm. A forensic team arrived from the Institute of Forensic Medicine. They photographed the scene from multiple angles, documenting the drum's position and the surrounding soil layers. Using cutting tools, they carefully opened the welded lid, working slowly to preserve any evidence inside. Inside, wrapped in deteriorated plastic sheeting that crumbled at touch, were skeletal remains, small, child-sized. The bones were transported to the Institute of Forensic Medicine in central Madrid, a grey building that smelled of formaldehyde and institutional cleaning products. Dr. Elena Vargas, a forensic anthropologist who'd studied in Barcelona and completed additional training in France, conducted the examination in a basement laboratory with fluorescent lights and stainless steel tables. The remains belonged to a child between 6 and 9 years old, she determined, by measuring femur length and examining dental development. Male, based on pelvic structure. Height, consistent with an average 7-year-old boy from that era. Time of death, approximately 10 to 15 years prior, based on bone degradation and soil analysis. Fragments of clothing remained, preserved by the sealed drum's protection from weather and scavengers. Blue cotton fibers, corroded metal buttons stamped with a manufacturer's mark, fragments of synthetic sole rubber from canvas shoes. Dr. Vargas noted signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, a depressed fracture on the right parietal bone, approximately 4 centimeters in diameter, suggesting impact from a heavy object like a pipe or tool handle. The fracture showed no signs of healing, indicating it occurred at or near time of death. She documented each finding meticulously, photographing the bones from multiple angles under different lighting, measuring dimensions with calipers, cataloguing every artifact found within the drum, a corroded metal button, a fragment of zipper, threads from what might have been underwear. The discovery made local news, but without identification, it generated limited attention beyond the immediate neighborhood. A brief article appeared in ABC and El País mentioning the find, speculating about possible connections to Civil War victims or criminal activity, but offering no conclusions. Detectives cross-referenced missing children from the 1970s. There were 43 cases in Madrid province alone, ranging from confirmed runaways who'd later been found to children who'd vanished without trace. Dental records, where they existed, were requested from families. Carmen Ruiz saw the newspaper article while sitting in the back room of a laundromat where she worked, eating a sandwich during her lunch break. Her hands trembled as she read the brief paragraphs. Blue clothing, male child, Villaverde, approximately 7 years old, died in the mid-1970s. She contacted the police that afternoon, her voice shaking as she explained who she was, what had happened to Pablo, why she believed the remains might be her son. Detective Ana Beltran, who now handled cold cases in addition to her regular caseload, met Carmen at the station the following morning. Carmen brought Pablo's dental records, retrieved from a clinic in Carabanchel that had miraculously kept archives from 1974, stored in cardboard boxes in a storage room the new dentist had considered throwing away until Carmen begged him to check. She also brought his school photograph, creased and faded from being carried in her purse for 13 years. His birth certificate, a small cloth bag containing a lock of his hair cut on his 6th birthday and saved in a jewelry box. "I knew he hadn't left," Carmen said, her voice steady despite tears tracking down her cheeks. "I always knew he was still here, somewhere, waiting to come home." Dental comparison was inconclusive. Only fragments of the child's jaw remained, and decomposition had damaged the teeth. The forensic odontologist could identify some similarities, tooth spacing, a cavity in one molar, but couldn't make a definitive match. Too much degradation, too little remaining structure. The forensic team needed more. Dr. Vargas suggested something new, something Carmen had heard about on television but didn't fully understand, a technology from America and England that seemed like science fiction. DNA analysis. In 1987, DNA profiling was still emerging in forensic science, barely 5 years old, as a practical investigative tool. Spain had limited capabilities, most testing conducted at university laboratories or sent abroad to facilities in France or England. But Dr. Vargas had recently attended a conference in London where she learned about mitochondrial DNA testing, particularly useful for degraded samples because mitochondrial DNA persists longer than nuclear DNA and exists in multiple copies within each cell. The process was explained carefully to Carmen in language stripped of technical jargon. Mitochondrial DNA passes unchanged from mother to child through the maternal line. If the remains were Pablo, his mitochondrial DNA would match Carmen's exactly. The test couldn't provide absolute certainty. Other maternal relatives would share the same mitochondrial sequence, but combined with circumstantial evidence like location, clothing, age, and time of death, it could offer strong confirmation. Carmen agreed immediately. "Do whatever you need, please." Blood was drawn at a laboratory affiliated with Universidad Complutense de Madrid, a research facility that had recently acquired equipment for genetic analysis. The process required specialized training and expensive reagents, funded partially by a grant studying forensic applications of DNA technology. Bone samples from the skeleton were processed, a painstaking procedure involving grinding the femur into powder, treating it with chemicals to extract DNA, then amplifying specific regions using polymerase chain reaction technology that was still relatively experimental. The laboratory was one of only 3 in Spain equipped for such analysis. Dr. Vargas worked closely with the technicians, a team led by Dr. Carlos Ruiz, no relation to Carmen, who'd completed his doctorate in molecular biology and saw forensic applications as the future of criminal investigation. The process took months. DNA extraction from degraded bone was difficult, often failing completely. The first attempt yielded insufficient material. The second showed contamination from soil bacteria. The third, using a different section of femur and refined protocols, produced usable results. By November 1987, results came back from the laboratory in a sealed envelope delivered by courier. Match probability, 99.8%. The mitochondrial DNA sequence from the skeletal remains matched Carmen Ruiz's sequence at every tested location. Statistical analysis accounting for the rarity of the specific sequence in the Spanish population yielded a probability that they shared a maternal lineage of 99.8%. The child buried in Villaverde was Pablo Ruiz Mendoza. Ana Beltrán reopened the case with new urgency, assembling a team and requesting resources that had been denied for years. She reviewed Solis's original notes, reading through his careful observations and the note he'd left about the truck. She contacted Torres, now a captain overseeing traffic enforcement, who provided the old registry search and his notes about the untraceable vehicles. Beltrán noticed something Solis had flagged but never fully pursued. One of the untraceable trucks had been reported stolen in June 1974, 2 months before Pablo's disappearance, from a warehouse in Legazpi that stored industrial supplies. The owner, a logistics company called Transportes Ibérica, had filed a claim but never recovered the vehicle. Beltrán requested records of vehicle recoveries and traffic stops from mid-1974, spending weeks in archives that smelled of mildew and old paper. She found a citation issued in October 1974 to a man named Mateo Ibarra for driving a commercial vehicle with expired registration near Aranjuez, south of Madrid. The vehicle description matched the stolen truck, a 1968 Pegaso diesel with a covered cargo bed and sliding side door. Ibarra's address at the time of the citation, a rented room in Carabanchel on Calle de los Mesejos, 3 blocks from Pablo's apartment building. Beltrán located Ibarra's criminal records. He had a history stretching back to the 1960s, petty theft, assault charges that were dropped when victims didn't testify, a suspended sentence for attempted robbery in 1973. In 1975, he'd been arrested in Valencia for burglary and served 4 years in prison. After release in 1979, he'd moved to Barcelona, working construction and day labor jobs under different names to avoid employers discovering his record. She built a comprehensive timeline. Ibarra had been living in Carabanchel throughout 1974, unemployed after being fired from the warehouse job in Legazpi, the same warehouse where the truck was stolen. He'd been evicted from a previous apartment in July for unpaid rent and threatening the landlord. Neighbors from that period, tracked down through city records and interviews, remembered him as erratic, prone to drinking, occasionally aggressive with women and children in the building. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Señora Pacheco, recalled seeing him drive a delivery truck in late summer 1974, despite having no legitimate employment. "I thought maybe he'd found work," she said during the interview. "But he'd come back at strange hours, sometimes very late at night." The welded drum was key evidence. Beltran discovered through Transports Iberica's records that the warehouse stored industrial containers, including metal drums used for transporting chemical adhesives and solvents. Inventory records from late 1974 showed discrepancies, several drums unaccounted for during an audit conducted after the truck theft was reported. Ibarra had worked at that warehouse for 6 months in 1973, primarily doing loading and occasional welding repairs on damaged containers. He'd been fired for stealing tools and materials, according to the supervisor's notes that remained in company files. Everything pointed toward Ibarra. Beltran obtained authorization for arrest and extradition from Barcelona. In January 1988, Barcelona police arrested Mateo Ibarra at a construction site in the Sants neighborhood where he worked as a day laborer under the name Miguel Ortega. He was 53, gaunt from years of hard labor and poor nutrition, missing several teeth, his hands scarred from decades of manual work. Beltran traveled from Madrid to conduct the interrogation personally, bringing case files and photographic evidence. The interrogation room was small and windowless, equipped with a table, 3 chairs, and a tape recorder. Ibarra sat hunched, his fingers drumming nervously on the metal table. He denied everything initially, his voice hoarse from smoking. He claimed he'd bought the truck legally from someone whose name he couldn't remember, paid cash in a bar somewhere in Vallecas or maybe Usera, he wasn't sure. He'd never been to Villaverde. He didn't know any children. He'd never heard of Pablo Ruiz. Beltran presented the evidence methodically, the truck's identification number matching the stolen vehicle, his proximity to Pablo's neighborhood, witness statements placing him in the area the day of the disappearance, his access to the warehouse where the drum originated. Ibarra's expression didn't change. He stared at the wall, his jaw clenched. Then Beltran mentioned the drum. "Industrial drum," she said, laying photographs on the table, welded shut, required specific tools and skill. "You worked as a welder." Ibarra looked at the photographs. His hands stopped drumming. "Where did you get the drum, Mateo?" Beltran asked quietly. Minutes passed. The tape recorder spun silently. Ibarra's breathing grew heavier. "I didn't mean to," he finally said, his voice barely audible. The confession came slowly, pulled out piece by piece over 6 hours of interrogation. Ibarra described September 18th, 1974, a Wednesday afternoon that had started like many others. No work, no money, drinking cheap wine in his room, while traffic noise filtered through the window. He'd taken the stolen truck, planning to collect scrap metal from construction sites to sell. He'd been driving on Calle del General Ricardos, drunk enough to feel reckless but not incapacitated, when he saw a boy chase a ball into the street. The boy darted between parked cars. Ibarra swerved, but clipped him with the truck's front bumper. The boy fell, hitting his head on the pavement. Ibarra stopped. He got out and saw the boy lying motionless, blood pooling beneath his head. People were walking nearby. He could hear voices from the shops, see pedestrians approaching. "I panicked," Ibarra said, his voice shaking. "The truck was stolen. I had warrants. If I called for help, they'd arrest me." He picked up the boy and put him in the back of the truck, covering him with a tarp. Then he drove away, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, his mind racing through options that all led to prison. By the time he reached the abandoned lots in Villaverde, Pablo was dead. Ibarra claimed he checked for breathing, for a pulse, found nothing. He'd killed him, he thought, accidentally, but still killed him. "So I buried him," Ibarra said. "I had the drum in the truck from the warehouse. I thought if I sealed it, no one would find him. Animals wouldn't dig him up." Beltran pressed for details. When exactly did Pablo die? Ibarra claimed it was in the truck, within minutes of the accident. Where did he get the welding equipment? From the warehouse, tools he'd stolen months earlier. Why did it take until late night? He'd driven around for hours, trying to decide what to do, drinking more wine to steady his nerves. The interrogation revealed inconsistencies. First, Ibarra claimed Pablo died instantly from the head injury. Then he admitted Pablo had been breathing when he put him in the truck, shallow, irregular breaths that stopped before they reached Villaverde. Then, under continued pressure, he said Pablo had cried, called for his mother, and Ibarra had tried to comfort him but didn't know how to help without exposing himself to arrest. Finally, near the end of the interrogation, he admitted hitting Pablo. "He wouldn't stop crying," Ibarra said, his voice flat. "It was loud, I thought people would hear, so I hit him with a tire iron to make him quiet." The confession matched Dr. Vargas's autopsy findings. The skull fracture was consistent with blunt force from a metal tool, the angle and depth indicating a deliberate strike delivered with significant force. The injury would have caused immediate unconsciousness and death within minutes to hours, depending on internal bleeding and brain trauma. Pablo hadn't died from the vehicle impact. He'd been murdered to silence his cries. Prosecutors built a case for first-degree murder, not manslaughter. The initial accident might have been unintentional, but the subsequent actions, striking Pablo with a weapon, placing him in a sealed drum while possibly still alive, concealing the body, demonstrated intent and premeditation. Ibarra recanted portions of his confession, then confessed again, with different details, claiming he couldn't remember clearly, that the wine had affected his memory, that maybe Pablo had already died, and the crying was his imagination. His inconsistencies weakened any sympathy the defense might have generated. The trial began in June 1989 at the Provincial Court of Madrid, a proceeding that attracted significant media attention given the DNA evidence, one of the first criminal cases in Spain to rely heavily on genetic profiling for victim identification. Carmen attended every session, sitting in the front row directly behind the prosecutor's table, her face expressionless throughout testimony about her son's final moments. Aurelio came from Seville for the verdict, sitting apart from Carmen, unable to meet her eyes. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence systematically. Dr. Vargas testified about the DNA match, explaining the science in terms the jury could understand: maternal inheritance, statistical probability, the reliability of the testing procedures. Dr. Carlos Ruiz corroborated her testimony, describing the laboratory protocols and quality controls. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence. Forensic testimony about the skull fracture and time of death. Witness testimony placing Ibarra in Carabanchel with the stolen truck. Records showing his access to the warehouse and welding equipment, and Ibarra's own recorded confessions, played in the courtroom with transcripts provided to jurors. The defense argued reasonable doubt, claiming the DNA evidence was too new and unproven to be reliable, that no witnesses had actually seen Pablo with Ibarra, that the confessions were coerced through exhaustive interrogation. They suggested Pablo might have been abducted by someone else, his body later discovered and concealed by Ibarra, who panicked upon finding it. But Ibarra's own words, recorded and transcribed, undermined every argument. His knowledge of details that hadn't been publicly released, the exact clothing Pablo wore, the red shoes, the specific location where the drum was buried, demonstrated direct involvement. The jury deliberated for 3 days, reviewing evidence and testimony, requesting clarification on the DNA statistics and the medical examiner's findings about cause of death. On June 23, 1989, they returned a verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree, guilty of concealment of a corpse. Judge Maria Sandoval sentenced Mateo Ibarra to 28 years in prison, the maximum penalty under Spanish law at the time for such crimes, given aggravating factors including the victim's age and the deliberate nature of the killing. Carmen didn't speak to reporters crowded outside the courthouse. She simply nodded once, acknowledging the verdict, and walked away escorted by members of Las Madres de la Esperanza, who'd attended to support her. In 1990, Carmen arranged for Pablo's remains to be buried in Carabanchel cemetery, not far from the apartment where she still lived. She purchased a modest headstone, grey granite with simple engraving, bearing his name, birth date, and the date his body was finally identified. Beneath that a single line, siempre en mi corazón, always in my heart. The funeral was small but dignified. Rosa Delgado and Pilar Santos from Las Madres de la Esperanza, Detective Ana Beltrán, who'd worked tirelessly to solve the case, Dr. Elena Vargas, who'd identified Pablo's remains, and Miguel Ortiz, the journalist, who'd written about the mothers years earlier and had followed the case through to its conclusion. Aurelio attended, but stood apart from the graveside service, unable to approach the coffin that held his son's bones. He left immediately after, returning to Seville without speaking to Carmen. Carmen placed Pablo's favorite toy in the coffin before it was sealed, a small metal car with missing wheels that he'd carried everywhere as a toddler. She also included a letter she'd written the night before, sealed in an envelope, its contents known only to her. The DNA analysis that identified Pablo became a landmark case in Spanish forensic science, cited in academic journals and legal proceedings for years afterward. Dr. Vargas presented findings at international conferences in Lyon, London, and Washington, contributing to broader acceptance and adoption of genetic profiling in criminal investigations across Europe. The case influenced training protocols for Spanish police academies, illustrating the importance of preserving evidence from unsolved cases and remaining open to technological advances that might eventually provide answers. Carmen continued living in the same apartment, keeping Pablo's room preserved, but no longer spending hours there in frozen grief. She packed away some of his toys, donating them to a children's hospital, but kept his photographs displayed throughout the apartment. School pictures, vacation snapshots, candid images of him playing in the courtyard. Once a month, she visited his grave, bringing fresh flowers, always carnations because Pablo had liked their smell. A detail she'd almost forgotten until it surfaced in memory during one early morning visit. She remained active with Las Madres de la Esperanza, now helping other families navigate investigations, offering support born from hard experience. The group evolved from informal meetings into a recognized advocacy organization, eventually registering officially as Asociación de Familias de Personas Desaparecidas. They pushed for better missing persons protocols, mandatory DNA databases for unidentified remains, and resources for families searching for lost children. Carmen became a voice for these reforms, testifying before government committees and speaking at public forums, despite her natural shyness. In 1995, she testified before a parliamentary committee examining unsolved disappearances from the Franco era and the transition period. She spoke calmly for 20 minutes, recounting her 13-year search, the failures of early investigations hampered by inadequate resources and bureaucratic indifference, and the DNA breakthrough that finally brought Pablo home. "Technology gave us an answer," she said, her voice clear despite emotion. "But it was refusal to forget that kept the case alive. We cannot let technology replace human commitment to justice." Her testimony contributed to legislation passed in 1996, mandating that DNA samples from unidentified remains be preserved indefinitely, and that families of missing persons be given priority access to emerging identification technologies. The law was informally known as Ley Pablo in legal circles, though never officially titled that way. In 1998, Miguel Ortiz interviewed Carmen for a retrospective article marking 10 years since Pablo's identification. He asked if she'd found peace. Carmen paused, looking out the window of her apartment toward the courtyard where Pablo had played. Peace, she repeated quietly. No. Peace suggests resolution, acceptance, moving beyond. I haven't moved beyond anything. But I found him. I know what happened. I know where he rests. That's enough. She died in 2003 at 74 from complications related to pneumonia that developed after a bout of flu she'd ignored while caring for an elderly neighbor. In her will, she requested to be buried beside Pablo in Carabanchel cemetery. On her headstone, she'd chosen her own inscription years earlier, writing it in her journal where she'd kept notes about Pablo's case. Nunca dejé de buscarte. I never stopped looking for you. The graves sit side by side in a quiet corner of the cemetery, shaded by a cypress tree that drops needles on the stones. Visitors occasionally leave flowers, even decades later. People who remember the case from news coverage, families who found hope in Carmen's persistence, students of forensic science who study the DNA breakthrough that changed Spanish criminal investigation. Mateo Ibarra served 18 years before being released on parole in 2007 for good behavior and age-related health issues. He died in 2011 in a public hospital in Barcelona, alone, never having expressed genuine remorse beyond his initial confession. In a final interview with a prison chaplain shortly before his release, asked if he had anything to say about Pablo Ruiz, he responded only, "I wish I'd stopped drinking that day, Doctor." Elena Vargas continued her work in forensic anthropology for another 25 years, helping identify victims of political violence from the Spanish Civil War era, improving methodologies for analyzing degraded remains, and training the next generation of forensic scientists. She retired in 2015, but remained active as a consultant on complex cases requiring specialized expertise. Detective Ana Beltran rose through ranks to lead Madrid's cold case unit, applying lessons from Pablo's investigation to dozens of other cases. She credited Carmen's determination as much as scientific advancement for the resolution, telling trainees that technology provides tools, but human commitment drives justice. The DNA was crucial, Beltran said in a 2016 interview for a documentary about unsolved cases. But Carmen never let us forget Pablo existed, that he mattered, that someone needed to keep searching. That's what really solved it. A mother who refused to accept that her son could just disappear and be forgotten. The case influenced Spanish law and procedure in multiple ways. The 1992 legislation mandating DNA preservation was followed by additional reforms in 1999, requiring regular reviews of cold cases, and in 2004 establishing a national DNA database for missing persons and unidentified remains. Las Madres de la Esperanza, renamed Asociación de Familias de Personas Desaparecidas, continues operating with government funding and private donations. The organization maintains a database of unsolved cases, provides legal support for families, advocates for policy changes, and offers counseling services for those navigating the particular grief of ambiguous loss. Rosa Delgado eventually found closure in 1994 when her daughter Elena's remains were identified through dental records at a construction site in Getafe. Pilar Santos never learned what happened to her son Miguel, but she remained active in the association until her death in 2009, helping others even without her own answers, finding purpose in collective action. Miguel Ortiz published a book in 2004 titled Las Madres que no olvidaron, The Mothers Who Didn't Forget, documenting their struggles, victories, and the broader social context of disappearances during Spain's transition to democracy. Carmen's story formed the central narrative, with chapters devoted to the investigation, the DNA breakthrough, and the trial. The book became required reading in some Spanish journalism programs as an example of investigative persistence, ethical reporting on trauma, and the role of media in advocating for marginalized voices. In 2012, Madrid City Council approved installation of a small memorial in Carabanchel, near the fountain where Pablo was last seen. The memorial consists of a bronze plaque mounted on a restored stone wall, surrounded by a small garden planted with carnations that bloom each spring. The inscription reads, "En memoria de Pablo Ruiz Mendoza y todos los niños perdidos, que nunca sean olvidados. In memory of Pablo Ruiz Mendoza and all lost children, may they never be forgotten." The plaque was Carmen's idea, written in her journal years before her death, alongside sketches of how she imagined it might look. When city officials found the journal among her effects, donated to the association by a distant cousin who inherited the apartment, they decided to honor the request. The dedication ceremony was attended by hundreds of people on a warm Sunday in May. Elderly neighbors who remembered the original search in 1974, young families who'd moved to the neighborhood decades later and learned about Pablo's story from the association's outreach work, forensic scientists who'd been inspired by the case, police officers who'd worked on it or studied it in training. Representatives from the association spoke, as did Detective Beltran and Dr. Vargas. A priest offered a blessing, a children's choir sang, a 7-year-old girl named Lucia, chosen by her teacher for the honor, placed the first flowers at the memorial's base, a bouquet of red carnations, at her mother's suggestion after learning about Carmen's monthly visits to the grave. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence, 2 minutes during which traffic noise faded and the courtyard felt suspended in collective memory. That evening, as the sun set over Carabanchel and families returned to their apartments for dinner, the carnations remained at the memorial's base, their scent carrying on the warm air, a reminder that some losses never fully heal but can transform into something that serves others, memory into advocacy, grief into determination, one mother's refusal to forget into a legacy that changed how Spain searches for its missing children.